is a very, spatially mobile room. Good afternoon. I'm Daryle, and faculty member here in Maryland in the history department, and I'm also co-PI on the Aggregating grant from Mellon. So it's been a fantastic experience for me, and I hope it has been for each of you as well. We're near the end of the formal programming, not quite there, which is great, but it's really been wonderful that so many people have come from the work that you're doing right now, the communities that you've already built, that they hopefully are going to be stronger here after this event, both, as Bonnie said yesterday, the physical and the virtual and the affective spaces that we're building together in Black DH studies. So we have a panel this afternoon, the last set of formal panels toward Black digital collaborative practice. And we'll have 11 presenters, which I'll introduce in just 1 second. I want to remind you all that this is a live streaming event. Matt right there is live streaming this. So if for some reason you are not comfortable with your face or your voice being live streamed, we have a couple options. You could step outside, obviously not participate, but also we may have some ways to accommodate. So if you are uncomfortable with that, please do think, both your actual presence on the live stream, but also what you say is being live streamed. And apparently we have...
Just a quick FYI, we have the panel on mute right now. I can see a couple of faces at that front table. If anybody would like to be muted, I can do that.
Okay, again, so if you'd like to be muted, say, I want to be muted. Again, we'll, of course, in here we'll hear that. A couple other things, you've heard about the various codes of conduct here for this, and they still apply. This room is a fantastic room in terms of audio, so both our panelists can speak basically almost without microphones, so there are some microphones there, but we have ambient microphones as well. So if you just speak in a normal voice, it should be able to be picked up. So that being said, I'm going to introduce all the panelists all at once, and then they'll speak in order of the introduction, and then we'll have a conversation. Okay? So our first speaker, not the first to appear in the program, but our first speaker, make sure I get this right, is Cecily Marcus from the University of Minnesota Libraries and Umbra Search. You can see some of the panels, the screens on Umbra Search. And she'll be speaking, Sarah Carlson is not here from Texas, but Cecily will be speaking on collaborations to create Black digital spaces, Umbra Search, and aggregating African American history. And I will state an apology on Cecily's behalf. It's not really an apology, but it's a sadness for us that she needs to leave right after her presentation because she needs to catch a flight. But I also want to say, of course, she and I, as it turns out, have the exact same glasses. Literally the same glasses, so we're kindred spirits here. All right, so next, after Cecily will be, let's see, my glasses here, let's see, Amy Earhart from Texas A&M, and she has 3 other co-presenters who are not able to join. Their names are in the program. And Amy will be speaking on power dynamics, examining digital project collaboration through the lens of Black DH. No, I'm sorry.
And Rebecca.
Rebecca, I misspoke. I was saying, Amy is here with Rebecca, as well, Rebecca Hawkins, and they're both from Texas A&M. Is that correct? Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then Hadassah, this is Hadassah St. Hubert from Florida International, who has some co-collaborators who are not here. But Hadassah will be speaking on capacity building opportunities with digital Library of the Caribbean, dLOC, and then finally my friend and fellow collaborator. Come up here, just move over. So you'll come a little bit closer so everyone can see. Get over here. Rehberger from Michigan State University, who works with Walter Hawthorne, among others, including me, and on enslaved peoples of the historic slave trade. So, Cecily, please. I'm going to give time, and hopefully our presenters will be succinct enough to get everything in, but also ample enough for us all to be excited to talk.
And I do apologize for having to speak and run. I will be watching the rest of this panel tomorrow to hear my fellow panelists as well as the discussion. So I'm Cecily Marcus. I'm here from the University of Minnesota Libraries, here to talk about Umbra Search. Umbra Search is something that I want to think about through the lens of an incomplete archive. This is to say that there is no archive that is complete. Every archive that we have is made of what has been saved. It's made of what hasn't been destroyed, what hasn't been thrown out, what hasn't been lost, what was created. And we all know that in terms of what was created, there's already a loss there in terms of what has not been created, what was not created. So if an archive or a library can be thought of as a repository for the possibility of understanding, for putting pieces together in a way that sheds light or truth onto something that we may have even thought we already understood, then there is always more to discover. Umbra Search has been an effort from the University of Minnesota Libraries and the Gibbons Collection of African American literature, not only to make the most of all of the digitization that has been happening across the country for the past 25 or more years. It's also an effort to make this history come alive, to put it in the hands of users, artists, K-12 students, communities, the general public, to use this history in ways that again makes it new. That archives, again, they're not dead. They are living. So Umbra Search is a search tool that brings together metadata and thumbnail images from digital collections all across the country. Now it has about 900,000 objects coming from about 1,000 different libraries and archives. We have founding partners in the Digital Public Library of America, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, Howard University, Amistad Research Center, Library of Congress, and more. And it has also grown to be a digitization effort, an effort to look at our own collections at the University of Minnesota and think about the word umbra. Umbra is the Latin term for the darkest part of the moon's shadow. It's the center, it's the core of what we are as Americans. This is not a marginal history, and yet there still is so much that is in the shadows. So at the University of Minnesota Libraries and Special Collections, we looked at our own collections to see where are the documents of African American history that aren't in an African American collection, that are in the GLBT collection, that are in the history of the YMCA, the history of social welfare, etc. And then also to bring these materials to people through public events, teaching, workshops, and other kinds of things. So this is a list of our partners. It's a growing list. Many of these partners are not academic institutions. They are community organizations with synergistic missions, and through MOUs and basically through MOUs and conversation and developing partnerships, we are able to work together to put these missions together in ways that enhance both Umbra Search and hopefully the organizations with whom we're working. We also have legal documents, data sharing agreements with some of our partners whose content we're not aggregating from the Digital Public Library of America. So at this point, about 2/3 of our content is coming from the DPLA, and the other third is about 20 different APIs, application programming interfaces, those straws that connect servers to servers so that we can bring in those materials as well. And that's to a point of the incompleteness. If you think about the DPLA, that's right now 29 million records. About 600,000 of those are identified by our search strategy of more than 1,000 terms of having to do with African American history. That's a tiny percentage and really demonstrates the work that institutions have to do to find their African American history materials, to describe them in ways that makes them findable, and to digitize them when appropriate. So this is what Umbra Search looks like right now. This is an older screenshot. We're up to about 900,000 records. And it's really a very typical search tool. It will give you suggestions as you type, and it will give you a diversity of formats, historical photos, manuscript materials, newspaper clippings, artwork, redacted FBI reports that are not comprehensive. Again, this is only what has been digitized. It's only what has been collected. These collections are much more complete, even in their incompleteness, at their home institutions. And so our attempt is really to get researchers to different institutional digital collections, even if they don't know where those materials are. You shouldn't have to know who has the best collection of James Weldon Johnson materials, or where Langston Hughes papers are, or where there's a correspondence collection from June Jordan before you start. Should be a way to open up those pathways for you. And then to take you to, in this case, the Amistad Research Center's collection at Tulane University, where you can discover the collection in its own context. The digitization grant, as I mentioned, this is an effort that's been funded by the Council on Library and Information Resources. I should say that the implementation, the building of the Umbra Search aggregating tool is funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And one of the things I've been thinking about in this conference, and I should have said at the start, thank you. It's really privileged to be here and to listen to all of this work. Thank you to the organizers who have put it together so beautifully. And I forgot what I was going to say before that, but it's so interesting to me and distressing in some ways of how much of the work that we're talking about here is grant funded. I want to see a world where these projects are core to the work that we do. They're core to our departments. They're not, project-based and never get to be something that is where we have promises of sustainability as much as we can have promises of sustainability. Anyway, the digitization effort will result in about 500,000 objects being digitized, one of the things that has come out of this effort is looking at how we describe our materials in archives and special collections. How processes like more product, less process, the faster way that we can get through our archival backlogs does a real disservice to diverse collections. It doesn't allow us to pull out names and dates and places that are beyond sort of the canonical, and more so it allows us to describe something at a box level, and that does not work for digitization when we digitize at an item level. We may not describe at an item level ever, unless it's an AV record, which really always needs to be described at an item level. But that challenge of how we're describing things so that they can be findable, so that they can be linked to these long histories is a challenge that we are thinking about and talking about with our partners all over the country. This is one of our attempts to really bring some of these stories to life. This is a WordPress site that's linked to the Umbra Search site, where our partners are doing digital exhibits, students, night lab timelines and story maps and other things are being displayed. And then we've had a series of outreach events with partners, both academic and non-academic. We've been able to convene events at Emory, at UCLA, at Howard and others, and then with Twin Cities artists and community centers, put on teaching workshops and all kinds of efforts to talk about different aspects of African American history, not just archives, not digitization, not aggregation, just different aspects of African American history generally. This is an exercise that we've developed and have been sharing with K through 12 teachers as well as faculty at universities. Really a very basic attempt to get students to do comparative searches between Google search and Umbra search, or really any digital collections interface, to start to understand the differences between primary sources and secondary sources, how they work in complementary ways, how they work against each other, and how they open up different kinds of pathways. But as I said at the start, one of the things that Umbra Search has done for the whole team that I'm here to represent is to allow us to think about what's not there. Can an aggregation of scale one that will grow, quarterly as we do new ingests. It's going to tell us not only what we've done, it's going to tell us what we've duplicated, and it's going to tell us how we're canonizing a history that was that began as a protest against the canon. Umbra Search still isn't doing enough, I think, to show you why you're not finding the results that you looked for. Is it because you did a bad search? Did you do something wrong? No. You may have been using a word that wasn't used by an archivist or a librarian. You might be looking for something that hasn't been collected. You might be looking for something that hasn't been digitized for copyright reasons or for many other reasons. And it really opens up questions about the role of archives and special collections in how we create collections and what possibilities the digital presents in terms of non-custodial collections, collections that libraries and institutions can have the infrastructure to digitize, to preserve, to make available, but they don't need to actually own the materials physically or intellectually, maybe just the digital surrogate. Is that a non-custodial relationship? Perhaps it's more of a quasi role. But the question of sustainability is really the major challenge, I think, of any digital project. And if I ask the leadership at my institution, what is long-term sustainability for a digital project, I don't get an answer. No one will say, is that 2 years? Is that 5 years? Is that 100 years? And as people, historians and scholars and archivists who are looking at a historical record that is hundreds and hundreds of years old, not even it being able to make a digital commitment for 2 to 5 years is very distressing. That is one of the places that our institutional partners have really come to play an important role. Though the work of reaching out to all of these different partners, starting with the digital archivist or the head of the Digital Humanities Center and moving sometimes all the way up to a provost or a dean to sign a legal document, that created institutional buy-in. That created accountability. And that's something that I think really bodes well for the long-term sustainability of something like the Umbra Search. If it were just us, it really would be, on our word. But instead, we have partners and collaborators with whom we work who can, who can speak with us, and that's really valuable. Another way to think about Umbra Search is to think about how it connects to many of the other kinds of digital projects and initiatives that have been discussed here. How does Umbra Search draw strength from the work of the Color Conventions Project? How does the work of digitization and visualization projects that scholars and students do demonstrate the impact of what happens when you make these materials available? One of the next things we'll be doing with Umbra Search is putting the JSON file, the raw HTML metadata, the raw code on every page so that we will have a huge data set of culturally relevant and rich material for people to use. What happens when people can do something with it that I couldn't even begin to touch? So I will say thank you, and I'm so, again, sorry I have to bolt. My lift is here and waiting. So thank you, and I will look forward to listening to the I asked if they could change it. They said no.
All right, we want to stay on time here. So thanks for coming to the very last session of this wonderful conference, and thanks to all who hosted it. It's been an amazing event. We're here representing 4 different PIs on this project and a host of graduate students and undergraduates, which we'll talk about in a minute. We now have a project website which has most of the information we're talking about on, and we'll be adding to that as we move through the project. So what we want to start by sort of focusing on is how we position our project as central to the way we think about Black cultural studies scholarship And because we're interested in social and cultural frameworks, we want to find a way to bring that into our digital Black bibliographical project. And so this project became not only to build a tool set that could do some really important things, but a way to think about what it meant to have a Black DH inflected collaborative project that really thought about power dynamics, hierarchies, institutional hierarchies, social hierarchies. So this is the group of PIs on the project. And so we, like a lot of DH projects, have a mix of folks from different disciplines. We have 4 faculty members, 2 from the library and 2 folks from the English department. And then we also have this wonderful project team. We brought in Performance Software Solutions to help with the Neo4j database that we customized. We were really fortunate to have 3 amazing PhD students, Elias Adno, Omar Mohammed, and Deanna Stover, who worked with us during parts of the project. Atusa Karami worked with me as an undergraduate student to sort of refine the data entry. And we also worked with Stephanie Emquist, who is manager of the Digitization Services Center. And we really want to emphasize that part of thinking about this as, through the lens of Black DH, is to think about how each of these folks are contributors to the project and how we equitably give them credit for the kind of work that they're doing in the project. So that was a central idea.
Okay, excuse me. So the Digital Black Bibliographic Project had as its focus Dorothy Porter Wesley, who was a very well-known librarian and archivist and bibliographer at Howard University. And she really is responsible for the premier collection that is at Howard University's Moreland Spingarn. And we also use Professor Abdul El-Kalimat's, who is the founder of Afro Scholar, and he's at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And so it was very important that we acknowledge who we are using and what we were dealing with in terms of transforming their bibliographies into this data. And so these are some of the ideas that we were thinking about. The coverage, thematic and spatial dynamics of Black cultural production over time. And so it was important to us to figure out ways to visualize these Black bibliographies and to really to show the dynamism of them and to show the activism of these 2 very important Black bibliographers. So we use Dorothy Porter Wesley's a catalog of the African collection in the Moreland Foundation, Howard University Library, and that was published in 1958. And Kalimat's Afro Scholar newsletter was published from 1983 to 1991. And what we were trying to do is to create these reusable data sets, but also to allow them to reveal some of the issues that we have. They're historical, looked at the field of Africana studies over time, pulling out some of the diverging theories and political areas, looking at it from various thematic, spatial, and cultural dynamics, and looking at it also from these individual bibliographers and why they pull this material together. And some of the objectives, as we said, as I've tried to highlight some of the more important words, is we wanted to develop an expanded and accurate data set for the Black cultural research, provide a means of collecting and manipulating those data that focused on race, deploy data mining, and if you look at our website, eventually we'll have some of this information up there because we also did visualization of the data. We wanted to build a database because it was quite a bit of data, and hopefully that data can be used by others. We're talking about really getting more graduate students to help us to input this data because it's pretty extensive. And right now we only have small set of data, and then to analyze and visualize this so that you can see different phases of Black Africana cultural production over years. So these are, again, the two individuals, Dorothy Porter Wesley and Abdul El-Kalimat, who also goes by Gerald McWhorter. And these are some of the things that we consider. The differences between Dorothy Porter's traditional bibliography, where she was a librarian and a lot of her work dealt with cataloging. It's a very traditional bibliography, while Afro Scholar was much more activist. He was mostly looking for those scholars who were omitted from traditional literature, but in many ways so was Dorothy Porter Wesley, was trying to include that. And both of them wanted to expand the canon of literature to include these individuals who are not usually seen. And oftentimes they were radical and revolutionary writers, especially in the case of El-Kalimat's Afro Scholar, if you get a chance to look at that. And then he expanded it to include conferences and other materials. So his work was more representative of that Black Power movement, and hers was more the traditional. These are the works of African and African American scholars.
So we, of course, turn to existing models, and we just want to highlight two that were really important to us. You probably are familiar with these. The first is the Off the Tracks Collaborators Bill of Rights, which was developed in a group of folks who were getting together to talk about the way alt-ac scholars were being treated and represented in digital humanities. We also looked at a Student Collaborators Bill of Rights, and we looked at these to see what kinds of best practices were being already articulated by the field. We found these really helpful. For example, the Student Collaborators Bill of Rights, sort of a core component is students will be paid for their work. We said, yes, we want that. Like, we're not going to just, have students do this of their own free will, and somehow they're going to osmosisly absorb this material and get something out of it. We want to make sure they're being paid to do this work. So we started with those kind of ideas, and we developed as a group. It included this development of collaboration values, included the graduate students who first were brought into the project. So this is what we decided we thought was really important for our project. All work is equally deserving of credit, even if there was differential loads or participations, that all work needed to be equally deserving of credit. We wanted all collaborators to be empowered to take credit for their work. What we didn't want to do is have the graduate students have some line under service somewhere that didn't really represent the intellectual work they're putting into the project. Projects should default to the most comprehensive model of attribution of credit. When you look on our website, you'll see a list of presentations. They always list the 4 PIs, sometimes include the graduate students depending on what they are, and then there'll be a little notation that says which of the PIs or which of the graduate students presented that material. So everyone gets a line on their CV to show their intellectual work, with the understanding that not everybody shows up at the conference, but that work is given attribution of credit. We also wanted to make sure that credit should have a legible trail that articulates the nature, extents, and dates of the contribution. So when students cycle in and out of the projects, we notate that. We wanted to make sure that the CV became the individual's place for articulating their contribution to the collaboration. This became really important. We had some interesting discussions in the English department about what it meant to have students as co-PIs, because we don't have good models for that. And when the students would turn in their annual CVs for evaluation, I would get calls like, why are the students always at the front of this list of people? I don't understand how to value this. What do we do? So we had those kind of discussions with the department as well to get them to think a little more broadly about intellectual work within these kind of projects. We wanted all collaborators to feel empowered to express their contributions honestly and comprehensively. And finally, we thought that credit for collaborative work should be portable and legible. This is especially important with graduate students, that they should retain sort of soft ownership of the work of the collaboration and be able to continue building on that even if they change institutions or projects. All right,
So we also looked at our collaboration policies. We really worked, this was all done beforehand, and it is really important to continually go back over these things. So anyone, again, who collaborated on the project should be listed. Websites and digital projects, whatever they are, the project team will be linked on the main page. All the PIs will be credited. So these were really very important to us in order to make sure we had a very equitable project. We also talked about universities, museums, libraries, and archives, because those are all sites that we were using in terms of our material. And so oftentimes you have to fight with these institutions to make sure that they allow you to do the kind of work that you want to do, and to make sure that your intellectual property is maintained by the group that is working on those. So all of these issues were really important to us. Any grants that we get, we're making sure that we're all included. Everything, anytime, including this presentation, anytime we do anything, we make sure that everybody is given credit, and we want to make sure that funders understand that it's important for us too.
Okay. Authorship, we want to kind of run through some best practices since we're running out of time. Inclusion of the entire team. We always talk about order of names as we start any project or conference. We default to alphabetical order, but sometimes we kind of mix that for workload. And we often, when we publish, want to use footnotes to sort of clarify, here's what people did. So it's a very clear path of project work. And again, I just want to briefly talk a little bit about students as we're running out of time. We not only wanted students to be paid, but we made sure that both our undergraduate and graduate students were in all project meetings and that they had intellectual ownership of the project. We mentioned that we were working with Dorothy Porter's African collection. We were so fortunate to have 2 Ghanaian graduate students with us. And I can remember the first time they opened it and they were like, okay, none of these countries in Africa are our countries. Like, everything is shuffled around. This is, 1958 versus today. They were like, how are we going to represent this? Then or now? What are we going to do? Where's colonialism in all this? Like, what do we want to mark up? Right? Because bibliography makes you put things in columns if you can make it data. So they had a real intellectual stake in articulating these sort of colonialist, how they wanted to handle these colonialist ideas within this data set, and that was really important to us. Do you want to end with Umar's wonderful quote?
Oh, so this was one of our students, Umar, and he said, the work with DIV was my first real time working on a team of more than 2 people in humanities research. So I learned a lot from my experience with the project. I feel there should be more graduate student professors collaboration in the humanities given my experience with DIV. It for one helps graduate students to observe how advanced scholars work so we can learn the craft firsthand. And it also puts hard deadlines and obligations on students to turn in their work on time, which should be good for their future careers. He was also particularly happy learning about how it is when dealing with minority artifacts to build personal relationship with holders of these records through Dr. Hankins' work.
And we're just going to end with a few questions that we're going to throw out there as we move into discussion in a bit. These are some other things that we wanted to think about. So thank you very much for your time.
My name is Hadassah Hubert. I am the clear postdoctoral fellow in data creation in Latin America and the Caribbean at Digital Library Division at Florida International. Yes. You have no idea how many times I've had to say that over and over and thinking to myself, how am I going to fit this on the business card? So I actually put my email up there because I did run out of business cards, so that way you can contact me. But let's get started. Digital Library of the Caribbean was started in 2004. It is the idea of Caribbean librarians. It is a platform for Caribbean research materials. Primarily at first, they were focused on digitizing Caribbean newspapers and making them available to the wider public. Okay. Miguel Asencio is the Executive Director of Digital Library of the Caribbean. He's located at Florida International University. Chelsea Dinsmore is the Technical Director, and Lori Taylor is our Digital Scholarship Director. They are located at the University of Florida. The University of Florida actually provides our technical infrastructure for us in kind. Also, University of the Virgin Islands is also one of our administrative founders. So, what is dLOC? dLOC's partners serve an international community of scholars, researchers, and people working together to preserve Caribbean patrimony. This includes legal documents, historical documents, governmental documents, any kind of research materials. dLOC's partners collaborate with scholars and teachers to promote and perform educational outreach for Caribbean studies. They create networks of digital scholarship and develop other research and teaching initiatives. dLOC's partners contribute significantly and directly to making Caribbean resource materials available. And you notice I keep saying dLOC's partners because the platform itself is nothing without the partners. I'm going to chat further about how many partners we have. A lot of the projects that Digital Library of the Caribbean works on is building capacity within the Caribbean to digitize their own materials. dLOC does not own any of these materials. Those materials stay there. We work continuously on training and making sure their digitization processes are on par and even above and further and better than those in the United States. We actually have Johnny Santivus who came for digitization training 2 weeks ago, and he was in conferences in Utah. And he's from the National Archives in Haiti, teaching other people in the United States, and we did some conferences in Europe, how to digitize materials using FAGI. FAGI is Federal Agency Digitization Guideline Initiatives. So this is kind of the highest quality scans you're getting out of your Caribbean. Okay. Currently, Digital Library of the Caribbean has about 65 partners, and we have 11 institutional members. Now, if you notice, I'm making the distinction between partners and members. Institutional members, you're the ones who help us build capacity. You actually pay, right? Partners, we mostly have partners in the Caribbean. They cannot afford, obviously, to continuously pay thousands of dollars. So we rely very much on US and European-based institutions to help us build our capacity. However, dLOC, up until now, has only had one full-time employee. I am the second full-time employee, once again on a clear postdoctoral fellowship for 2 years. But nonetheless, we have made over 3.5 million pages of material open access and freely accessible. So far this year, we've had about 32 million hits on the website, 173 total since 2006. We have 41,000 different titles and 217,000 items on the Digital Library of the Caribbean website made available, once again, freely. This is actually a short list of some of our partners. Some of them are not currently listed because they don't want to be listed until they started uploading materials. So recently, the University of Guyana signed on to be a partner, and I believe the National Library of Guyana as well. So as you can see, Archives National d'Haïti, Bibliothèque Nationale d'Haïti, Bibliothèque Nationale Aruba. I mean, this is only a partial list. One of the websites that we actually, one of the digital humanities websites that we worked on is Haitian Island Luminous. So Haitian Island Luminous was created by historian Adam Sylvia. He was a graduate student at Florida International University. After the earthquake, he was very much concerned about making primary source documents available not only for researchers in the United States, but those who are working in the Caribbean. So it's actually a trilingual digital humanities website, about 500 years of history, Haitian history. Obviously, it's unequally distributed, but nonetheless, we managed to get 107 different contributors to the website from the United States, from the Caribbean, and also in Europe. So it combines like the rare books and manuscripts that we have from our partners at the National Archives of Haiti, at Bibliothèque Nationale, and other archives in the Caribbean, and actually pair them up with scholarly contributions. And this was launched in 2014, but the idea came about in about 2009, and then further was pushed, especially after the 2010 earthquake. Oh, and this is actually because of the popularity of the website, they actually pushed us to have like a physical exhibit. So at the Little Haiti Cultural Center, we do have like a kiosk where many visitors have come. That is me with Edu's Dante back, right? She's a supporter of the website. We actually recently put another kiosk at Saint-La Haitian Community Center because they were like, why don't we have one? We work with children all the time, they need this, and it's also a great way for them to learn Creole since the website was translated. And also they use it for French too, but they're more focused on the Creole, which I agree with. So another one of the projects, so dLOC actually currently has about 30 or so ongoing projects. I know because I had to do a spreadsheet to figure out how many projects are we working on, because I kind of came in like, what is going on here? We're all over the place. But one of the projects that I actually brought on and with our partner is the Diaspora Bicultural Arts Incubator. Last year, Rosie Gordon-Wallace, who's the founder of this organization that supports Caribbean and Latin American artists, we applied and won an IMLS grant, Institute for Museum and Library Services. If any of you are interested in that, please let me know. The deadline is November 1st, so if you're probably interested the following year, please let me know so that way I can actually guide you through the application process. But we won this grant to digitize her collection, which is held at the University of Miami, and we are actually training them and her staff to digitize the collection and make this huge repository of Caribbean artists, living artists, by the way, support living artists, living Black artists, available for researchers. So we're very much excited to kind of work on her archive. And once again, this is all work that's done in collaboration. So you have Diaspora Vibe, you have University of Miami, you have Florida International University under Digital Library of the Caribbean. So I know, I feel like I breezed through this pretty quickly. I didn't realize that. But for more information on the Digital Library of the Caribbean, please visit us at dLOC.com. iluminous.fiu.edu. I know I sent a ton of bookmarks all over the place. If you did not get one, I probably only have 3 left. I'm sorry. But please feel free to contact me. Also follow us on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, and I very much look forward to your questions and how do we do this work, how do we collaborate, but also how do we further build capacity of Caribbean projects in general. So, thank you.
I'm going to talk about a Mellon-funded project that we're doing right now called Enslaved, People of the Historic Slave Trade. It's a huge project. There's over 45 people working on it right now. I'm not going to be able to tell you all about it. I'm going to kind of give you an overview of parts of it, but you can always visit our website, enslaved.org, to get a better sense of what is going on. We're actually still in the first phase of the project, and I'll talk a little about that. To get started, though, I'm from Matrix, a Digital Humanities Center at Michigan State University. We are the second oldest digital humanities center in the country. There's this one at George Mason, I can't think of the name. That's Otero and that kind of stuff. They're a year older than us. We're unique in that for most of our history we focused on Africa and African American projects. A few are listed here. If you go to our first page, African Online Digital Library, African Activist Archive, the American Black Journal, which goes all the way back to the 1960s. We've done a lot. We have a wonderful new project that we just posted, the Archive of Malian Photography, thanks to the NEH for that, as well as a number of others. So visit the site to take a look at projects we have. Oh, two other just short, real quick notes. Another NEH IMLS funded project, Globe Index, is about 15 years old. We just launched this week a new interface for it. So you might want to take a look at it. It does have a number of African American quilt collections as part of it. And one other announcement before I get started. We have an Enslaved conference March 8th and 9th of 2019. You can find out more at enslaved.org. We did actually close as of the 15th, but if you do have a data set and you want to present, just talk to me. We can still get you in. We have people coming from all over the world, from Africa, from Brazil, Cuba. It should be a great conference. You were at the first one? All right. So here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about what we're doing with Enslaved and the kind of the objectives and the issues with this project. One of the things is that this has been a great conference. I can't thank my friends Catherine, Trevor, and Daryle. They've just done a wonderful job with this. But anyways, back to our objectives. Our primary objective, as I said, well, one of the themes that's definitely emerged within this conference is the idea of how do we take the fragments from the archive and in an ethical way rebuild lives. And that is exactly what Enslaved is about and what we're trying to do. The focus is people. The focus is biography. The focus is telling a story about a person. We're doing this through linked open data. So there's a big contradiction in this whole thing. It seems like a contradiction. What we're actually going to do is take data and we're going to flatten it and we're going to pare it down as a way for us to collect more data. We're going to talk about another objective is to come up with best practices and workflows for large projects like this. We also want to be able to publish data sets. So if people have data sets, we want to be able to publish them and give you scholarly recognition, as in the sciences. You can get that. And of course, we want to think about preservation and sustainability. So as I said, we're really in a kind of our first phase of this. And for the first phase, we have 8 partners. We have Henry Lovejoy with Liberated Africans. We have Daryle Williams with slave biographies. Slave Societies is Jane Landers down at Vanderbilt. Voyages, of course, David Eltis, you all know the transatlantic slave voyages. Freedom Narratives is at York University at the Tubman Center with Paul Lovejoy. And Biographies of the Enslaved is Skip Gates out of the Hutchins Center. And what we're basically doing is taking their data, we're creating RDF nodes, and then we're going to feed those all to a central hub. So when you search that hub, you're going to be able to find people at all these other places. Makes sense, right? You don't have to explain anything else? Talk a little more. So one of the things that we've done, and we spent a lot of time on, actually the last 7 years since we got an NEH grant to do slave biographies, is look at core data for people, events, and place. And we've been working on defining that really for the last 7 years. And what we want to do is really take your basic data set, you got a nice table like this, and we're just going to blow it apart, and we want every single little field, and what we want to do is create what's called an RDF triple. Right? So you have a perfect example here, Anna, born, subject, predicate, object, Anna born, 1831. Anna married, 1852. Anna manumission, 18 whatever. Okay, so you're going to take all of those little pieces of data, you're going to rip them out of the data sets, and you're going to put them in what we call a big triple store, right? And then we're going to write in this wonderful new technology called BlazeGraph, which can actually take billions, not millions, but billions of these triples, and then can run indexing of these things, right? To do that, though, of course, we have to do. Stop doing we have to do what's called build an ontology, right? And so what we've been doing for the last 6 months is building an ontology. Here it is. Again, you look at it real fast, you understand it. In the middle there is the person, right? That's the agent record. And then, of course, what we had to do was model all the data about that person for every piece. And again, I'm going to skip ahead a little here. For the agent record, basically what we pared it down to is you have an origin record, a race record, an age record, a sex record, an occupation record, a person's status record, a name record, inter-agent relationship record, who they're married to, who they're related to, and a participant role record, what they've done. Almost all our data, of course, the terrible tragedy of slavery, of course, is people were treated like objects, right? But because they were treated like objects, there's actually lots of records out there. People like to keep records of their property. And that's what we're basically doing, is we're looking at those event records. And some aren't always just property records, some are marriage records, baptismal records, things like that. But it's a way for us to gather this, so everything's really kind of based on that notion of an event. And you can kind of see, I'll give you some examples. So for a sex record, we actually have, that goes to the person record, we have a controlled vocabulary of certain items. For something like a race record, we just allow a string. If you ever get 10 historians in a room, we had 32 a couple of weeks ago, and try to get them to agree on anything, it's almost impossible. So we actually, one of the data sets we have has over 265 different terms for race. Okay? So we just let people fill in the string that they have. Now, I'm going to step back real quick. I don't have a lot of time.
We have 6.5 minutes.
Oh, thank goodness. You guys all know Wikipedia, right? Well, there's this other thing called Wikidata, right? Wikidata is actually trying to be the authoritative place for data. And we know that Wikipedia is built on Wikimedia, which allows anyone in the world actually to start their own wiki. I started one in oral history in the digital age, right? But for Wikidata, they have what's called Wikibase, right? Wikibase is what's going to allow us to actually take those billions of triples and then map them into our data model. Okay? And this hopefully will help you make sense. Because so far, we've actually, in kind of going through these records and trying to reconcile who's in them, we actually did already find matches between 2 different data sets. So here you have Sam Hawkins, who appears in the Free Black Database Register in Louisiana Slave Days State Record. Okay? So in those 2 different things. So for him, he's an instance, he's an agent. We have a sex record, he's a male. And that's derived from 2 different things. He has a race record. In one record he's called the mulatto, in the other record he's called black. Right? We do have an age record. At one point he is identified as 9 years old in Louisiana Slave Database sale records. He has a status record of being an enslaved person in one record, and he also a free person. Right? He has an occupation, domestic service. And then he's participated in several different events from the two things. Relocated, registered person, person being born, he was captured. He has an owner record, and then finally he has a name record. Now, here's what you have to imagine. This is from 8 data sets that we're reconciling. Right? Imagine if we have 10,000 data sets. And in those 10,000 data sets, we can find 6 records of Sam. Right? Then all of a sudden, what happens is, of course, the story of his life grows richer and grows thicker. Right? Because we have all these things. And the best part of all of this is you get to go back to the original records. Right? We tell you where those things were found so that then you can find them. Does that make sense? Okay. So real quick, a few other things to just go over. The other thing that we're doing, this is being headed up by Daryle, is that we're providing a place where people can publish their data sets. One of the tragedies in the humanities is that you guys go out and collect information, you collect documents, you collect information about enslaved people, you write your article, and then you put your stuff in a file drawer and nobody ever sees it, right? We want to have a place, whether you have 10 records or 10,000 records, that you can actually publish that data so that we share and collaborate around the world, right? And that everyone can use that data. It's just not for you, for your one publication, but can be used by everyone. And then finally, I have some kind of images of what it's going to look like. We are also going to have, courtesy of Skip Gates, in his biography collection, we're going to have over 63.
You've got about 3 more minutes.
All right. We're going to have over 63 biographies of individuals on the site for educational purposes. So that when people get there, they can actually find not only a fuller biography of a person, which we hope as we work on this, that people will be able to create these biographies out of the data that they find, right? And so it not only includes kind of life events, but then where are the sources, where did that information come from when we were building that image of this particular person. Now, and we also have, if there is a map, a story, and this person's actually very interesting. He was a scholar of the Quran, and then he was enslaved. When he was freed in the United States, he actually went back to Mali. With that said, there's 2 really important things that come up with doing this kind of data work. One is that when you saw Sam Watkins' record, one of the things we do is we do a reconciliation algorithm, and that's really based on how we actually study historians. We get Daryle to sit down and say, how does he decide that 2 people are the same people? What does he use? And we build that into an algorithm. We talk to other historians. We actually have about 4 or 5 different algorithms. And then we run that. We at no point ever say that 2 records are identical. We might say it's 99% chance that these are the same person, but that's the best we can say is 99%. We might say it's 70%, we might say it's 50%, we might say it's only 20%. But again, that's up to you as a scholar. You get that record, you can look at the original records to find out, do you agree or disagree? Make sense? With that, I'll end, and thank you for your time.
So we have about 15, maybe a little bit more, 20 minutes for open discussion. And I'll be happy to direct your questions to the panelists. Yes. Could you identify yourself, please?
My name is Alex Gila. I'm a Columbia University librarian there. For the first panel is here at Umbra, sadly, but I connected to the enslaved things. Just right before this this panel, we had our panel a sort of overview of some of the projects that are being done around slavery and the African American past and digital environments. And one of the things that I failed to find in every single one, including the open link data dream, is anything in the metadata that allows us to understand by what means the artifacts that are hosted in archives and institutions became the property of those archives and institutions. While we tend to gravitate towards the Google dream of, we'll be able to finally find that piece of information, we're imagining a subject of research that is interested in the one story of Jack or James, and not the scholars right now working and trying to understand how those stories were erased in the first place and how they became fragmented. So this dream of unity fails to understand what it is right now that we are, a certain segment of the scholarship is trying to get at, which is how did these fragmentations and brokenness happen in the first place, tied to the same fragmentation and brokenness that fuel slavery. So if the panelists can address that.
You know, I think that's a very good question. I think it's a very interesting question. And I think there's lots of different answers to it. And I think there's lots of different audiences for this kind of information. I think for the scholar, in this particular case, three different answers. One is for the scholar, I think it's what it does is it brings lots of information together. It doesn't, I think for any scholar, I don't think you're creating a whole person. I think what they're seeing is the different fragments that they're going to have to analyze and the legitimacy of this. But it's one of the problems with big data. When we have so many records like this, how can we pull them together so that the scholar can then make some decisions about the validity of this data? Two, most of our partners actually do have agreements in place with the sites where we got the information. All of our original partners do. So I know that that's always a problem for historians. They go into an archive somewhere, they collect data, they bring it out. Who does it belong to is a difficult question.
Maybe I could ask people to amplify a little bit. So the question of provenance, certainly enslaved, the citation, the original citation, the origin of the data, since enslaved is really about spreadsheets principally. The origin of the data is a field that's attached to one of those records. But particularly for those of you that are working with, and I think that's also similar to something, you're mainly dealing with data here, though it has an origin, in other kinds of objects. But particularly with those of you that are working with physical objects, not just data, but also with scans, for instance, how do you also navigate that in terms of questions of provenance and ownership and rights, and the relationship of all these questions back to the original historical experience of the individual or individuals whose lives have been broken up in these various ways.
Just a quick refinement. It's not only provenance, so we're all very familiar with provenance. It is trace of the mechanisms themselves by which, or the legal frameworks, you may say, by which these things ended up being fragmented, become invisible. And that's what I'm saying. So it's not only provenance, sure, I can trade, and it was first here, there. It's like, what and how was the law being negotiated around those points, or how was violence deployed in order for this to be here?
Structural relations.
Structural relations of power, theft, where did it happen? Violence. It's not just like it was in Michigan first and then
and I will say too, because I used to be the senior archivist at the Amistad Research Center, and so the whole issue of provenance is really problematic, but also the issue of, in particular, the Amistad has the papers of the Amistad Africans, and what happens when an institution gets material, what is revealed and what is concealed. So in the case of Amistad, and I'm always talking about this particular instance, is those papers had been there for years. And of course you can trace how they got to Amistad because of the American Missionary Association and their involvement with the Amistad Africans in terms of them being on trial, and because the American Missionary Association was the organization that paid for the attorneys and got and helped them to win their trial. But also the problem of that particular situation was after the Africans came and they housed them and everything, and of course these Africans wanted to go home, but going home presented challenges to the missionaries, and so in terms of them going back, their whole story changed, especially in the case of who is the Amistad hero, Sinke. His whole storyline changed, that now because they wanted to go back, unless they went back to the missions and was, proselytizing, their own people, then in terms of how they talked about them, changed, they changed Sinkei's narrative and say that he became a slave trader, which there was absolutely no proof of. And so oftentimes it is how those papers, because even at Amistad, and I was there for years, and never knew that until I started reading about the history, that half of the Amistad Africans, including Sinkei, were Muslims. So all of that history was hidden. And so you never heard anything about it until I started asking, well, why didn't anybody talk about this? You know, why? There are stories that you can find about the Amistad Africans where they're asking questions, why is Sinkei the one who is the leader? And I could tell them why he was the leader as a Muslim. And so there are all these stories, I think, that are distorted even within the archives, and you oftentimes don't know the full story until you have different voices and different gazes upon them.
Real quickly, we call the people of the historic slave trade because this includes captains, court judges. The Legacy Project out of London is actually about the families who made money off of slavery. So we do try to actually preserve the mechanisms and the court cases of the particular times.
I just want to throw out sort of another kind of issue that I think relates to what Alex is saying, this idea of ownership and how it connects with different copyrights across different countries. And for those of you that don't know, there was a really wonderful panel on copyright and ownership across the larger sort of global community that Alex put together 2 years ago. Anyway, so the sort of ownership anecdote I want to throw out, my students and I published a unknown manuscript and pulp fiction essay along with notes from Malcolm X's autobiography of Malcolm X. Is now a freely open online peer-reviewed publication. And one of the things that we found, we had manuscripts, we had note cards that were marked up, and we wanted to publish these, but we had to find out how to get owner, like who owned these things. And here I think is what Alex is getting at. When we traced ownership, what we found was that the intellectual property rights of Alex Haley's estate when he died, he was bankrupt and they were sold. And when we finally found out what happened to them, they were sold for $10,000, his entire intellectual property rights, to a motivational speaker in Florida. Wow. Now those are the stories we need to know and tell, and we need to think about what that means. So all I had to do was write Mr. Motivational Speaker, and he said, yeah, you can publish them, right? And that's a very different kind of situation that we have. Like we have some really wonderful Elridge Cleaver papers I wanted to work on digitizing, and there's a different ownership. We know who Kathleen Cleaver owns them, and she has total control over whether they can be published or not. So
no, she does.
She does not. Oh, she doesn't. See, this is always the problem. So anyway, those lines need to be teased out and made clear. Yeah.
So let's get another question. Pardon?
Oh, this actually
Introduce yourself, please.
Oh, sorry. I'm Purdom Glad. I'm at Myth, and so my question kind of builds on some of the things that Alex in the discussion of the panelists have sort of pointed out. And I'm curious, and this is probably too big of a question for the last 5 minutes on the last panel of the day, but what can we do within the digital interface or within the data itself to open up space to investigate this? I was seriously compelled by your students investigating these maps that have the maps are clearly the architecture and infrastructure of colonialism. How do we build in, I mean, this is to nuance the questions of ownership and these sort of structural violences and sites of rupture within our interfaces and our linked data, because I think that there's potential there, where it's not necessarily pointing to one particular answer. You know, I really like, Dean, your slide that it opens up the possible ability for scholarly analysis, and so I'm wondering if we can think through, and maybe you have observations about how to represent an invitation to kind of think about the sort of structural architectures of colonialism and violence. That was a big question.
I mean, so dLOC actually does not claim any ownership to any of these materials. Every single partner that we work with sets a copyright statement for every single, all of the materials that they have there. We actually do have 4 million pages of content, but certain partners just want to use us as a repository and not make some of that available, and that's a choice, you know. So we fully support that. It's like, hey, you know what? It's digitized, but we don't want to release this right now. So that's kind of how we deal with kind of issues of like copyright and ownership. It's really up to them. We give power back to those specific archives and organizations, particularly in the Caribbean. With the collection that we're working with now, Diaspora Vibe, certain artists, you know, she was like, hey, certain artists, I don't want their artwork up there, but I just want it digitized on the repository. Like I need, you know, certain artists are going to be like, hey, if you're going to reproduce this, you need to contact me. So we're working on copyright statements for every single one of these artist profiles, because they don't, you know, we have to respect ultimately what they want with their stuff. So some of them are like, listen, if you want this reproduced, because we know what happens with artists. Big companies come in and they go and see their stuff online and they're like, oh, let me just pull this up, and then it's a marketing campaign, and then all of a sudden these artists, you know, they have to find lawyers and do all these kind of things that they can't afford, once again, because we do not support living artists as much. So what I like about Diaspora Vibe, they do have the lawyers to kind of back them, right? So they're like, we already have these copyrights, we already have these things set when we're supporting these artists and incubating them and helping them within their practice. But I think ultimately we need to give the power back to those institutions where that information is being produced from. That being said, I mean, in my own dissertation, I worked in Haiti's participation in World's Fairs and Expositions. Did a lot of work here in DC, and there's a lot of items that are off-site in the Smithsonian that have not been exhibited since 1885. Or older, that are unclear. Well, no, not unclear. There is no documentation that it was actually officially given as a gift. And in addition, when the Haitian government did request these materials back in 1949, when it was, you know, having their own international exposition, it was like, oh, well, it's just so damaged. We couldn't possibly do that. I mean, why would we want to send you this valuable collection of portraits back, and you guys, you know, you don't have the capacity to do so. And meanwhile, Yale has those same very paintings currently right now, so they fly in someone from Haiti to teach them how to conserve these portraits, and then, but are they going to be repatriated? The question of repatriation, I mean, once again, these are, quote, valuable collections, and we never talk about how we're going to go to these areas where they're produced from and build capacity there, because we could do that. It's a long-term thing, it's a long-term commitment, but we do not want to do that. At least those institutions. I want to do that.
You won't do it?
No. I'm in.
Hi, I'm John Bartrell, and at Duke University. I'm in the Special Collections Library. So going back to your question, I think this kind of leads in with what everybody said. Most archives and repositories are bad at archiving and repositories, right? Their own history, particularly how they acquire materials. So unless the question of copyright comes up, you more often than not will not investigate the genesis or the provenance of a collection. I'm a curator. When someone says, I have this thing, my initial reaction is, I'm so glad you have it. How can we get it into our institution? I never ask the question of how did you come about this? All right, now it comes up if you buy something from a dealer and they got it under some unscrupulous terms, right? Because now you're investing money in something that may have been gotten. And I'll be transparent, we had to return some stuff, some Greek manuscripts, because they were taken out of a temple. Okay. But for things that are out of copyright, like slave records, nobody's going to ask that question. And so it becomes, what it would take is some investigation of the institutions that have these materials And some of that stuff is depending on when it was acquired, like if they've had it since 1880, there's no document, right? They weren't signing agreements. The level of documentation of how things are acquired has become more sophisticated over time. But if you're talking about things that were brought in the 80s, it's like half a page sometimes, depending on what that agreement is like. And the question is never asked, how did you come about it? So that's why you don't have it.
Can I do a quick pivot? I know we have to go, but I also want to kind of reframe Alex's question in the way I heard it, because I hear the conversation about artifacts and provenance, but I'm also hearing in Alex's question, like, we're talking about slave records, but we're talking about slaves as artifacts also, especially when we're talking about linked open data. And so I think that's a slightly, I'm not going to make it like this is different in the kind of like one versus the other type of thing, because I think this is also a very important point about provenance of artifacts and museums and archives. Like, that's actually really crucial. We saw that happen in Wakanda with coffee and all the things. But I also think there's something very particular about data about slaves and the enslaved, and how do we talk about the violence that was done to create the object that is the record, I think is also something that we don't have time right now to get into. But I think that is, I will say honestly, like, I'm actually still waiting for that part of the database and the presentation and to hear about that part, because it feels like that is sort of a thing that has been stepped back from. And I'm happy to talk to Dean and Daryle after, of course. But that I think that's the underlying context there for that database in particular, and is the reason why you have this other question of provenance in the first place with archives and collections and structures of museums, because that's a sort of ongoing, unfolding legacy.
Well, I think a quick answer is, I think one of the problems here is, say, someone like Walter Hawthorne collects this data in Brazil and Guinea-Bissau. He writes his book about how the people were exploited. So the history is actually, the history that Daryle writes will be about the violence of the acts, right? But then they also have these data records. So our hope is someone else can find these data records and also write about the violence of the act. But they have to be able to find them. And there's no reason to send people back to the same archives again to do the same work if somebody has already done that work. And that's what we're hoping.
And so so the only thing I would add to that is that yes, that does happen, and that is sort of the project that us as historians of slavery have been up to. I would be interested in how that gets translated into the digital artifact interface as part of the conversation around the public presentation.
I can give you a concrete example of that right now. So my own research, but other people's research deals with slave ships, and the number of people on a slave ship, some of which then become named, and they become like the core of enslaved is really about named individuals. However, we know in the slave ships certain individuals died, others were kidnapped, others were disappeared. And so the question is, the data set is, do you create spaces, lines, unnamed or unknown? And then what does that signify relative to the named and known people? So this is a big question we're beginning with right now about how do you build that into the data set? What's the difference between an unnamed or unknown? What's the difference between an unnamed and an unknown, first of all? And then the unnamed and unknown relative to the named people in a larger data framework, which can be queryable at the individual level, but also at a collective cohort level by age, gender, whatever you'd like to ask, is something like core to the data that then the data infrastructure allows the researcher to query, to construct lives, fragmented, whole, etc. That's an example of something that this particular model is trying to grapple with.
Sure.
Yes.
But as another example of that, and that just struck me as you're thinking, that we have birth records, right? We have birth records, but embedded in those birth records are what were the circumstances of conception, right? And there's violence attached to that in some cases, not all cases, but many cases. And so how does that then become shown through an archive or shown through a kind of database like that, where there's, and that's that there's a difference between saying, looking and seeing someone was born, and there's a difference between knowing what the circumstances for the mother was in that birth, but also in that conception.
But I do think that's going to have to be interpreted, because I agree that in many cases that's true, but we can't simply say for all of this data, this is always true, right? You have to say it's for the historian to do the historical work that's necessary to contextualize.
I just want to say, when you had Sam up there, if Sam's a mulatto, the circumstances of his birth is pretty clear. What happened? So I don't know if you want to put a note in there, but to me, when I saw that, I thought, okay, we know where that came from.
But the problem is he was also labeled in another data set as black. So as a historian, you'd have to go in, do the research to say which one was, more significant, which one was. We can't simply because someone is labeled that as a database say, then this is true, but not true,
But couldn't you use the relational database to have both at the same time, right? Like, there's no reason why he has to be one or the other.
Sure, I think that's.
And you can build that in.
Well,
So-
that's what we've done.
Yeah.
So we are out of time. I have a couple of announcements. There is some food left over. Take it, give it to your student. If you have students, give it to your students. Take it home. Probably more importantly, though, we're going to have a closing event right across the street, the Frederick Douglass statue, which you might get to see from this window. Thank our technical people as well. Now when you start talking more like put it all together. So because FIU
Yeah, I graduated. Right now I moved 8 miles away. Yeah.